Hey guys, why don't you take a seat? One of the things that we like to do last year at NCMS is just take a minute or two and chat. And so if you have a question, we open it up to the room. And if you're in the chat, the Muppets on the top floor will shout. No, I'm just joking. We'll shout it down to us if you're in the chat and you do have a question. But before we get into that, Bubba, I want to focus in on something that you said that you didn't really touch on a whole lot, but I know this is part of the heartbeat of LTN. I know this is part of Luke's heartbeat as well with the mission trips. I've been on 2, and I'll be back with LTN at PAX Unplugged here in a couple of weeks, which I'm really excited for. They're really great experiences. But it's such an interesting environment because for me as a Christian growing up in the church, even as a nerd, you walk into some of these conventions. My wife has said, Mark, I'd rather go to Africa with you 5 times than go to one of these conventions because it's just not my wife's space, right? And to be honest, I am leagues outside of my own comfort zone in them, even as a nerd very frequently. But one of the things that LTN really focuses on in training and prep and then being there is this importance of meeting people where they are and just building relationships with them, which happens so easily over a board game. And I've seen it firsthand happen. Can you talk just for the briefest, just a few moments about why relational evangelism specifically is so important to you guys at LTN? Yeah,
and I think that's good. I mean, as we're talking about defining terms and phrases and words that we're going to use, relational evangelism, that's the thing. It's different than street preaching. Okay, I was a youth pastor for 5.5 years, and that was the longest decade of my life. And it's one of those things where I took students into like situations and scenarios where they were ill-equipped. I mean, on every level, they were ill-equipped to have those conversations with people. But that's what you do on a missions trip, ? I don't know, like you're supposed to go and do these kinds of things. And so we decided very early on in Love Thy Nerd that, man, we'd build such great relationships with people at these conventions. What would it be like if we just leaned into that as our ministry model, right? We're going to let them kind of decide where we are and what we do. And honestly, that's kind of what it is. Like God's driving everything that we do, but the shifting of culture, we don't listen or follow anybody on Reddit or X or anything like that. We listen to the people that are in that space, and they tell us kind of as the winds are changing. And so the relational part of it allows us to have conversations with people who, again, are not talking to anybody else. But now we're starting to see that, much like this person in the post, like that's becoming a common occurrence. That people they're not just like, oh, you see me and you understand. They're starting to reach out to other people on our behalf. People will say things like, oh, yeah, that's that Christian organization, right? And they're like, stop, I hear you, it's different. I don't know how to get, it's going to take a long time for you to get to how it's different, but I promise that it is different. And the way that has changed, it's not by the words that I say, it's by the things that I do. It's by how our organization lives out and the actual partnerships and relationships that we build over the course of a decade now. Matt and I have been building relationships with people close to like 15 years that are now starting to see some fruit. Here's a great example. I didn't have this example last time because this is how time works in the calendar, right? And so we'd been loving and just being there with a guy and his now wife for years. I mean, since we were Game Church, it went all the way back. And so we'd loved them well through those times. And when the two of them, who were industry people, were getting married, they said, hey, Bubba, will you come and do our wedding? I just said yes. We didn't look at any of the details or anything like that, but it's like, absolutely, I will make everything work. I missed a show. You were at Origins. I missed a show to go and do that wedding because that was the most important thing that I could do in that moment. He trusted me at that moment with everything, literally everything in his life. The most important thing in his life at that moment was marrying the love of his life. And he said, I couldn't think of anybody else but you to be there for that. And that's not, oh, Bubba's great. That's the relationship. Everybody can be in a similar situation to that. Maybe you're not officiating weddings, but in a similar situation where people have the most deep and emotional parts of their life that they want to share with you. I think that's the benefit of relational outreach.
Yeah, I love that. Obviously, street preaching could be the equivalent of sort of a disembodied evangelism, right? And the online space and nerd space can lend itself more to that than less, right? We can become more disembodied rather than more embodied in the space. And I think the goal and what I love about LTN, and it's part of our heartbeat at Lux, is this idea of being incarnational. How do I actually be there with you, build a relationship with you, know your name, know your spiritual story, know where you've been, walk with you through something, and through the relationship that we built, you get to know Jesus because you have hands-on experience through me trying to live like Jesus while in relationship with you. I just want to challenge and also encourage us, any of us who's in nerd ministry in this room, it can be very tempting to look at big numbers, YouTube videos, comments, reposts, viral things, and be like, that's really what ministry is about, is like spreading the gospel as virally as possible. And a lot of what NCMS has been focused on, because it's what LTN and Lux are focused on, is the exact opposite of that. It's grow small, grow intentionally, build relationships, know people deeply, love them well. And those things are really, really important to us, and one of the things I really want to emphasize. Anybody have any questions, anything that Bubba talked about you just want to emphasize or poke at just a little bit before we close and move on? Yeah, go ahead, man. I'm going to say it for the stream. The question that was asked was, Bubba said he's seeing what he assumed to be one of the last dominoes to fall, which is churches getting on board and church involvement. How are you actually seeing that happen?
Yeah, so I was very surprised because we met a lot of resistance pretty early on. I mean, full stop resistance early on. Just not, I don't really understand that. Just, no, we don't do that. And so we pivoted out of that. I was actually on staff at a church, and I found myself going outside of that environment to be fulfilled in my calling, to serve Jesus, just generally speaking. I found myself having to go and join organizations at that time like Game Church that would allow me to go on these mission trips where I could effect change and talk to people who understood the things that I understood. I was going into, these parts of the world that understood the language that I spoke, which is very important, not just for the people that hear it, but also for the people that speak it. And so when we started to see kind of some of these churches come on board, we started to see it with our home churches, right? Like the people that told us no initially, but then watched for the next 5 to 7 years, things grow. And churches see ministries pop up all the time. All the time. We had a handbag ministry at our church at one point. I can't tell you why, but it lasted about a week and a half, but it got a logo, and so that's how you know it was official. But that thing came and went, whereas people have seen the things that I'm doing with Love Thy Nerd specifically, and now we held NCMS at my church. Like, there's no looking away from that, right? When I tell them 100 people from 10 different countries show up, their heads turn. And so they're left with no other option than to embrace this thing. They may not understand it, but now the people that said no, their kids are starting to grow up a little bit more. Starting to play a little bit more Fortnite and do the Snoop Dogg dance and all sorts of stuff. And so, like, they're looking for answers, and they have none. And if they can see somebody who does, that they love and they trust, that's where we started to kind of see that turn. And then we started to see other people get on board that were like, man, it's working for you. Maybe it can work for me. And that started to grow. And so the domino fell a lot earlier than I had expected it to, but man, I'm so glad that it did. I'm so glad it did, because now you can get up on a Sunday morning and preach and talk about Captain America and nerd culture stuff and like whatever you want to, and people in the audience, in the congregation, feel seen because of that. I have conversations with pastors all the time, and I'm like, just add one nerdy reference to something that you're talking about. The easiest one is Yoda. It's just the easiest in the world, all right? We're always talking about people should do things and don't do things, like, oh, I'm trying really hard. Do or do not, there is no try. You don't even have to quote Yoda. They'll come tell you, oh, I didn't know you were Star Wars, like all sorts of stuff. Like, when people start to feel seen, then people in the upper levels of, like leadership and stuff, they start to feel that from the bottom up. And so that's kind of, for us, where it started, and what I've seen it kind of spread. And I mean, man, you got to talk to Nerd Pastor Nate down here in the front, man, about what's going on at conferences and UMCs and getting rooms and screens and all sorts of stuff. It's wild. I have been contacted by organizations. I've been contacted by camps. I've been contacted by people, top down, all over the place, that are like, hey, can you do that with us? Jamie's another guy to talk to about that. because he planted Satellite right here, Satellite Gaming in Colorado Springs with a church. And so like we're starting to see, again, that cultural zeitgeist really change because we were steadfast.
I think it's that. I think two other things I just want to mention. One, there's a massive shift inside the church in America right now where boomer pastors who planted their churches and late Gen Xers are handing the reins to millennial pastors right now who are secretly nerds and no one knew. And then they connect with one of our ministries and they're like, oh my freaking, I play Destiny every night. Can we please talk, right? And it's like, we find so many people who come in who are youth pastors and pastors who are partially home at Lux now, where we're like the church that they're growing at, but they're pastoring their church because, man, they just needed a place where they could catch a breath of fresh air with people who understand them. The other thing I want to say is Jamie is going to be one of our keynotes on the last day. Wave, Jamie. And one of the things that he is going to talk about is the ability to communicate between what we're doing and what the church world and other ministry worlds are in a way that's effective that people can actually receive and what stories actually translate. One of the biggest obstacles that we have as nerds is that we're too nerdy sometimes. And we talk about things that people who don't understand the world that we're in rightfully don't give a rip about. And it sabotages our ability to get people on board because we don't tell the right stories. And one of the things that Jamie is going to be, I don't want to steal your thunder, but I'm freaking really excited. I'm genuinely really excited about it because of what Satellite has done, and the ability for them to make something that's sustainable is very unique in this space. And a lot of that is because of Jamie's capability of communicating between what he's doing and what he loves and people who don't know anything about it in a way that's really effective and stories that really reach. And so make sure you're here in the keynote for that.
I think that the interesting thing about that, and then we'll move on to the next one, is that, again, speaking the language is important. And so many of us that are, kind of starting this and leading out with it are pastors or former pastors. And so we speak that language. And for those of you in this room that are like, man, how do I tell my pastor about this? We can do that. This live stream, this video can do that. I love to sit down with pastors. Oh my gosh, I love to sit down with pastors. The first thing I do when I sit down with a pastor is talk to them about the books that are on their shelves. Hey man, you like things. I've read that book. What did you think about that? I find something I can talk about, and I engage them in the spaces that they're in. But what it does is it kind of evens the playing ground. They see me as a human. I see them as a human. And now we can have a conversation about how people can be reached with the love of Jesus in that space.